Good evening, everybody. My name's Jaqui Dyer, and I'm one of the directors of Black Thrive Global, and I'm a councillor here in Lambeth, in Kennington Ward, and I'm also the cabinet member for Inclusive Economy and Equalities. So welcome to Lambeth Town Hall, and it's a real pleasure to have this event here with you and share this with you this evening. And if I could just provide a bit of background around the person who's going to be sharing with you some real insights that I know that you're going to really find so valuable in your journey on the anti-racism agenda. Camara Phyllis Jones, MD, MPH, PhD, is a family physician and epidemiologist who is currently a Leverhulme visiting professor in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. Her work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the US and the wider world. Camara taught for 6 years as an assistant professor at the Harvard School of Public Health and served for 14 years as a medical officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. As president of the American Public Health Association, she launched the association on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks: to name racism, ask how racism is operating there, and organize and strategize to act. Her presidential initiative catalyzed the first of over 250 declarations by local jurisdictions across 43 US states and the District of Columbia that racism is a public health crisis. Her counsel has been sought on many advisory bodies, including most recently the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, Committee on Advancing Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in STEM organizations, and the recently launched O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination and Global Health. Camara is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the National Academy of Medicine. She is also an honorary member of the Royal Society of Public Health and a member of the NASEM Roundtable on Black Men and Black Women in Science, Engineering and Medicine. She was a key scientific advisor for the award-winning PBS film series Unnatural Causes. Is inequality making us sick? I have had the pleasure of hearing Camara speak many times on this subject, and we are honored that she's doing this, her final public lecture, as Leverhulme visiting professor at King's College London University in partnership with Black Thrive Global. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Camara Jones, who will provide you with actionable insights on how we address racism denial and move closer to being and becoming a society where anti-racism is the norm. Please give a round of applause for Professor Camara Jones.
Well, thank you all. I am delighted that all of you are here, and there are many more of you streaming online if our live stream has come together well. And I first want to thank Councillor Jaqui Dyer, Professor Stephanie Hatch, Professor Ann Pollock. I want to thank I really want to thank PhD student, one-day Professor Emediong Jumbo, who is working with me this whole year I've been here and pulled this whole event together. So thank you, Emediong. Where are you? I don't see her. She's out working. Oh, there she is. She's taking a picture. She's in the back. And I really want to thank you all for coming. So we had a wonderful dinner. Thank you, Chef Vix. And thank you also to the, what is the name? I'm sorry now, it's Healthy for the, huh? Healthy Eaters for the patties, and thank you all. So now, we had music with youth sayers, we had food, we have our company here, and now we're going to get down to serious business, which doesn't mean that it has to be hard to understand. But I'm going to be talking about confronting racism denial, which I have come to recognize is a huge barrier in our anti-racism work. Because, well, first of all, racism denial is like, I think it's like a black hole in our national landscapes. You can hear from my accent that I'm from the United States, but I've been here for nearly a year now in the UK, in London, coming to understand the racial climate and the damages of racism and the like in this country. And in both of our countries, there are many people who are in staunch denial that racism exists or continues to exist and has profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of our nations and the world. And racism denial is like a black hole in the universe, massive, if you know anything about astronomy, massive, powerful, sucks everything in, but invisible. Because in the universe, in a black hole, even when the light comes near, it gets sucked in. And so that is how racism denial is operating. So we need to go beyond denying racism. We need to name racism and move to action. I want to, so it's not working. Is my, hold on. It is here. You know what? I'm going to have to stand here. I wanted to move around. Oh, wait. Yeah, he fixed it. They are telling me to do something with my scarf. Do something with my microphone. What about the mic? Is my, Sean, is my mic muffled? It's fine. That's my daughter and my husband. Thank you, guys. Anyway, so anti-racism is a process, and the three tasks that when I launched my national campaign against racism for the American Public Health Association 7 years ago in 2016, those three tasks are actually the task of anti-racism as a process. The first thing is to name racism because we must name a problem in order to get started on the solution. The sound does sound a little echoey to me, but as necessary as it is to name racism, it's necessary but insufficient because there are many people, especially since the gruesome, horrendous murder of Mr. George Floyd in the United States in 2020, and after the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color across the world within nations and between nations, people have been more willing to name racism. But if that's all they do, that's not going to change the situations in which we find ourselves. So it's necessary to name racism, but insufficient. We must move to action. So the second task is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Where the here could be in my child's primary school, or in my job, or in my neighborhood, or in this city, or in this nation. And so I'm going to give you tools, first of all, for naming racism, and then tools for asking, how is racism operating here? But the third task is after you've done the landscaping, to identify fruitful targets for action, levers for intervention. We need to organize and strategize to act because we have power as individuals. We have tools around us. We can put things on agendas. We can hire students or, speak up on behalf of people. There's a lot we can do as individuals, but the real power is collective power. Collective action informs us, it inspires us, it propels us, it protects us. So these are the three tasks of anti-racism as a process. But let me say this, yes, they come in order, one after the other, they are sequential, but after you've done that once, are you done? Oh no. They are looping, they are iterative. So after you've gone through this process once, then you need to name racism again, and still. People will say, oh, didn't we do that? Didn't we have a plan for that? That's so 2020. But we need to name racism again and still, and then we need to ask, how is it operating here? Hopefully with bigger reaches into things that we can touch and dismantle, and then continue to organize and strategize to act, to create a critical mass. So the tools that I'm going to give you are going to be for all three of those things. This talk is going to be in two parts. The first is going to be 4 key messages for naming racism, where the 4 key messages are that racism exists, that racism is a system, that racism saps the strengths of the whole society, and that, yes, we can act to dismantle racism. And I actually will share some of my allegories, my teaching stories, to help illustrate these points. Not that people in this room don't understand, but that these are good communication tools when you're trying to convey these important messages to others. So these 4 key messages: racism exists, racism is a system, racism saps the strength of the whole society, and we can act to dismantle racism. After I share those communication tools, then we are going to switch to action tools, and I will share with you a framework that I call my Anti-Racism Collaborative, with 8 collective action teams, as a possible way that people here could think about taking on 1 or more pieces of how to address racism and become actively anti-racism. The first story of the 4, I call it Dual Reality, a restaurant saga, and it's to help illustrate and communicate that racism exists. This story, like many of my allegories, is based on something that happened in my own real life. So I want you to step into my shoes as a first-year medical student, where I was, of course, very diligent, very studious, and so on one particular Saturday, like on most, I woke up early, and what did I do? I hit the books and hit them hard, nose in, studying deeply. And it was already mid-afternoon when some of my friends came over. Now, these friends were also medical students, so they didn't distract me from my studies. Instead, we joined in, and we all got to studying together, long and hard, and it was getting later, and we were getting hungrier, and I had no food in my apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends actually understood. And they said, Camara, we got that. You don't have any food in here, but we are hungry, so let's go into town and find something to eat. So that's what we do, and that's where this story about racism exists starts. So we go into town, and we find a restaurant. And we walk in, and we sit down, and the menus are presented, and we order our food, and the food is served. Here we are eating. Now, let me just tell you that people my age in the United States thought they already knew what the moral of this story was going to be, that we weren't served. But we were. So now you're wondering, well, you're sure dragging this out a long time. Dr. Jones, please get to the point. Okay. So here we are, sitting in a restaurant eating, and I look up across the room, and I see a sign that is a startling revelation to me about racism. And now I hope I've intrigued you, and you're saying, well, okay, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? What did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now maybe I've lost some of you. How is a sign that says open a startling revelation about racism? So let me recap. Here we are, sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open, and thinking no more about it, I assume other hungry people can walk in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that actually the restaurant was now closed, due to the hour, but firmly closed. and that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism, in fact, creates a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant, at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for white Brits to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, even in the midst of the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we finally had vaccines and the US was sequestering so much of the global supply of COVID-19 vaccine in our nation. But those on the outside, they are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do what? Why, you can even talk to the restaurant owner, who is, after all, inside with you, and you can say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door, let them come in? You'll make more money. And oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass some food through the window. Or maybe what you'll do is tear down the sign or try to break through the door. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, why don't those people just come on in and sit down and eat? Because you will understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign that proclaims open to you. So when I have 5 minutes to share with a group of people, either people whose whole life experience has said, this is the land of equal opportunity, you know, don't talk to me about racism, schmacism, or to people who are in the struggle and need a communication tool that's clear, that exhibits that, yes, racism exists, it's structuring two-sided or multi-sided signs, it's creating a dual or multifaceted reality. This is the story that I share. And actually, twice when I was in a setting where we had all the time in the world, I started a 3-hour conversation on 2 occasions with the following question. Question being, how could people who were born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And both times it was a 3-hour-long conversation because there are many, many, many ways to know. What I will say right now is that I am heartened that more people who were born inside the restaurant and just 3.5 years ago might have been sitting inside eating and saying, well, what are those people outside saying? Black lives matter? Don't they know all lives matter? More of those people are now actually proclaiming, yes, Black lives matter. More people born inside the restaurant are saying the word racism. They're putting together the phrase structural racism, systemic racism. That's heartening, right? But here's my warning. If that's all any of us do, if we just name racism, as important as it is to name racism, to say the whole word, don't stop at race, don't stop at equality, diversity, inclusion, equity, disproportionalities, disparities, all those things. Those are good things to work on and to be about. But if we work on all those things without saying the word racism, then we, like others, living in this context of widespread and deeply held racism denial, may forget why we said that thing, because racism denial is so seductive that in 6 months we may fall into what I describe as the Oh, the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial. So we must go beyond saying a thing, beyond naming racism, to action, which means we do need to tear down the sign, but racism is not just a sign. It's a sign, it's the door, it's the lock. There's a whole system going on. We need to dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges, and I tell you this, once we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. This is a true thing, and those of you all who are involved, especially in collective action, understand that even if you're not immediately successful, the power that you understand that you have, when you move off of naming a thing and actually try to change a thing, is intoxicating, and especially when you're doing it with a group of other people. So, I want to now shift gears, and I will say this. It is so tempting for me to say, if any of you ever have a question right now as I'm talking, raise your hand, I'll stop and we'll address it. But I know from experience that if I do that, we will talk all night, right? And I'll never finish everything. So what I'm going to say is I am going to share these 4 stories in this framework, and then we'll have lots of time for community discussion. But if there's anything that anybody feels burning in their soul, and I cannot let her go one more minute because she's speaking my truth, or how dare she say that, that's not true at all, or whatever it is, or I've been studying this my whole life for 60 years, and I want to add this point at this time, then please raise your hand. I will finish my sentence, and I will engage your questions. But if it's not that deep, then, or burning, you know what I'm saying, then we'll hold the discussion to the end. So now I'm going to share with you my definition of racism. And when I say the word racism, I am clear that I'm talking about a system. I am not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. And yes, racism shows up at all sides in all of those ways and more. But in its essence, racism is a system of power. And a system of doing what? A system of doing 2 things. A system of structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race in a race-conscious society. And I give you myself to start with as an example. In all of the states in the US, if you look at me, I'm clearly black. In some parts of Brazil, you look at me and I'm just as clearly white. I have experienced this. In South Africa, you look at me, I'm just as clearly colored. I have experienced this. What I'm saying is that here I am, same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in those 3 settings and many others would assign me to different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would take on that of the group to which I've been assigned, and my educational outcome, and maybe criminal legal outcome, and all of those to the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes and behaviors and culture and all of that in all of these places. What I'm saying about me is not just because of my particular appearance, you know, light skin, frizzy hair. For every single person in here and every single person in the sound of my voice, there is some other place on this earth where your so-called race would be quite different from how you are living it today. What we call race is not written in our genes. We have measured, we've mapped the human genome. There is no basis within the human genome for racial subspeciation. Race is not biology. Race is the substrate on which racism operates day to day and across the centuries to structure opportunity and assign value. And you can tell that I used to give an hour-long lecture on race. What is race? But we're not going there now. But if race is this social interpretation of how one looks on the street, something that a police officer recognizes just as well as a teacher in a classroom or a judge in a courtroom or a taxi driver or whatever, that race has profound impacts on our life and experiences. Racism is operating on that and has impacts. So what are the impacts of racism? Well, when people finally do recognize that racism exists, then they usually understand that racism is unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. That's an important recognition, I would say. But it shouldn't take any of us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. That's the whole issue of unearned white privilege, which in my country, and it's my observation in this country too, we hardly ever talk about, because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. And actually, you know, I used to be in the before COVID times, when I was talking to a group of people, and it would be, you know, mixed folks, but I would see some white folks start to fidget when I put that up. And I would almost apologize for their discomfort. And I would say, oh, you know, I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. If you feel uncomfortable, shake it off. Stay with me. I'll tell you more stories. I do not apologize for that discomfort anymore. In fact, what I say is if recognizing the reality of unearned white privilege makes any of us uncomfortable, we need to lean into that discomfort by doing what? By reading more. Read history. Talk to strangers. Go across town and stay a while. You know, there are many ways that we can lean into that discomfort. And why do I say that we should lean into discomfort as opposed to shrink back for it? It's because I have come to recognize that for every single one of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us miss, and that is that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And so I could talk for an hour on that. I will just say that, especially in my country, I'm more familiar with these particular examples. But when we don't vigorously invest in the full, excellent, state-financed public education of all of our children because some decision makers are wearing blinders that makes them think that there's no genius in the barrios and the ghettos on the reservations, we can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. Of course, there's genius in all of our communities. If we were to fully invest in the genius in all of our communities, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. In this country, I've come to recognize that Black folks are disproportionately not only incarcerated, like in the US, when the same blinders that don't value all of us equally have made us as a nation in the US complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from potential and genius. But also the way that you guys are disproportionately sectioning people, involuntary confinement in mental institutions, and then not even giving people the full excellent care. I mean, it's another manifestation of the same thing. And when we do this, and do not understand that we are locking away leadership and genius and courage and all of these amazing creativity, we are sapping the strength of the whole society by our complacence and inaction, indifference and inaction in the face of this system and in the face of need. That last point about how racism saps the strength of the whole society, I actually think it's the most important point for us to lift up these days. With media stories, data collection, conversations around, political tables, academic tables, dining room tables, so that more people are filled with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. I could talk a lot more on this slide, but I'm trying to be very focused. So I will just say that that same definition of racism that I just gave you can be generalized, yes, to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So we could say, well, what is sexism? Well, that's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society. And there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today, intersecting in communities, intersecting in individuals. And all of these are at least risk markers for how opportunity is structured and value is assigned, even as a smaller set are actually risk factors in the progression to disease, or, because I'm a health person, I'm a doctor and an epidemiologist, I put everything in terms of disease. But when people see me say this, they say, well, that's curious, Dr. Jones. Your whole career, decades, has been focused on naming race as an axis of inequity and racism as a system of structured inequity. And now, Dr. Jones, you're telling me you recognize all this other is going on? Why are you so focused on race and racism? To which I reply, racism is foundational in the history and wealth of the United States. It is foundational in the wealth and history of the United Kingdom. And yet many people are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of our nations and the world. So when you have that combination of factors, something that's foundational and still enlivening all of the structures and policies and practices and norms and values of our societies, and people are in denial that it even exists, we all need to start there. We all need to become actively anti-racism. And you'll notice I don't say actively anti-racist. Why don't I say that? Because if you say anti-racist, some people get confused and say, ooh, is she talking about me? And I'm not talking about people. There are a lot of people I could talk about, right? But I'm not. I'm talking about a system. Well, I think all of us need to be actively anti-racism, even as we engage in as many of, or all of these other struggles, and to the extent that we are able to dismantle the mechanisms of racism, the other struggles will benefit as well. There are many people in our city, in our country, in this world who value comfort. Am I right? And there are many people in this city, in this country, that value, in this world, who value social justice. Yes, right? And in the current status quo, valuing comfort and valuing social justice are at polar opposite ends of a value system. There's a tension there. Now, I'm not saying that you can't be sort of comfortable while you're working on social justice, but if your value system is, I want comfort, unless you expand the we that needs to be comfortable to be everybody, then that's at opposite ends of valuing social justice. And in fact, those who value comfort are very much like those who were born inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity and eating. They are benefited by the status quo. They are comfortable in the status quo, which is why they value comfort. They don't even wonder why nobody else is coming inside the restaurant. They may not even notice, because they're so enthralled with their food and the conversation they're having among their small little company of group. They don't want to examine the sign. They may have heard that there's some rumor that there's a two-sided sign going on. They don't even want to go near the sign to take a look on the other side because it might make their children uncomfortable. In the United States right now, there are forces passing laws across the United States saying you can't talk about racism, history, LGBTQ, discrimination, or any of these social justice because it might make the children uncomfortable. They don't care to know what the outsiders are saying. I said, well, maybe somebody 3.5 years ago was craning. What are those people saying outside? Most people sitting inside the restaurant don't even care what the outsiders are saying, and they certainly don't believe that an outsider could add anything to their conversation. They may have been instructed that they need to diversify the people around that table, and they may comply grudgingly, right, by bringing an outsider in to make a more politically correct picture, but they honestly don't believe that an outsider would bring genius or creativity or leadership or new insights, which of course they would. People who are sitting here inside this restaurant eating don't even wonder how the food that they're eating got to them. They don't recognize or acknowledge that the same people who are outside the restaurant can't come in, sit down and eat, are the ones who grew the food, transported the food, cooked the food in the kitchen, serving the food, but still can't eat. And finally, these people who value comfort do not want to budge from their seats at the table. They jealously guard their privilege, which they don't even recognize or acknowledge as privilege, but understand as an entitlement. Now, those who value social justice because they know two things. They know, first of all, that there is a two-sided sign going on. Many of them know that because they were born outside the sign but could look through the window and see people inside eating. They also know that the operation of that two-sided sign saps the strength of the whole society. But I am not suggesting that the circumstances of one's birth completely determines their value system. In fact, there are people who were born inside the restaurant but who might wonder, why aren't other people coming in? What are those people outside saying? Might try to figure out what is wrong with this picture, and they make their way outside, and then on the outside they experience their common humanity in very different circumstances and recognize the brilliance and all that's out there, but also see the reality that the sign says closed on the other side. And there are people who were born outside the restaurant, who through dint of lots of hard work and degrees, me, MD, MPH, PhD, and sometimes a promise, a deadly promise in my estimation, but a promise that if they are allowed to come inside, they will never mention that they saw anything that said closed, right? But they make their way inside. Often when these people make their way inside, they are positioned near the window so the other outsiders can see them, and often they use that position near the window to stick their foot in the door to make it easier for others to come inside. But sometimes they are the worst gatekeepers, and they fortify the locks. We could have a lot of conversation, I'm sure, about people we know and things we've seen, in all of these circumstances. We're not going there, but what I am going to say right now is that part of our anti-racism struggle is actually to move more people from valuing comfort to valuing social justice, even as we recognize that valuing social justice in the current status quo will not always or maybe ever be comfortable. So now I'm going to shift from that first story, which, that story started out as 5 minutes, and each of my stories expands as I tell it more and more. And I'm sure in our discussion I will expand it again. And each time I learn something new from these stories, then I share them with the next group. This next one is the first story that I actually started telling. I published it 23 years ago in 2000, but I've been telling it for 6 years before that. So this story is much longer than what it started about, but I'm going to try to be very concise. First of all, what I'm going to do is talk to you about different levels of racism and how they can impact health and education and housing and all of the different aspects of our lives. I was, as a physician and an epidemiologist, was also always wondering, how could racism turn into differences in asthma prevalence between different communities, or the numbers of our babies dying before their first birthday, the infant mortality rates, or the numbers of would-be mothers dying in childbirth-related causes, the maternal mortality rates, or COVID-19 mortality, or diabetes and high blood pressure. How could racism do that, right? And I was clear it was racism doing it because race is just here I go. Okay, I'm just going to say it, and I'm not going to explain it, but race is just a rough measure or proxy for social class, rougher for culture, meaningless for genes, but is an excellent predictor of health outcomes both in your country and in mine. And the question is why, and it's because it's a precise marker of the impacts of racism on health, what we said, the socially assigned race. So how could it do it? I described 3 levels of racism: institutionalized, which I now, the newer terminology would be structural racism; personally mediated racism, which some people call interpersonal racism. Why don't I say interpersonal racism? Why do I do a tongue twister, personally mediated racism? Because I still understand racism as a system, and this is the system mediated through people. And then the 3rd level of racism, internalized racism. I am going to briefly define each of these levels, give you some quick examples of how they can impact health, but you can also, if you're working in housing or criminal legal outcomes or wherever you're working, you can see that. And then I'm going to illustrate them with my second story, the gardener's tale allegory. So what is institutionalized or structural racism? That is the system, okay? That is the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values which taken together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws and in our customs and background norms. This is the kind of racism that shows up as inherited disadvantage and its reciprocal inherited advantage. And we see it in terms of material conditions as well as in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access to quality housing or equal educational opportunities or equal employment opportunities or even the same level of income at the same level of employment by race. You notice that all of my things are differential by race when I'm talking about racism. Especially in the US, so now I know you have a National Health Service, and I know that it's not perfect, but it's trying, and it's much better than what we have in the US, which is like no system, like lots of different systems and lots of people. So especially in the US, but here as well, I would say, differential access by race to medical facilities or quality medical facilities. In the US, it includes physical access, financial access, linguistic access, and that can impact health. Differential access to a clean environment and the very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations and the like in communities of color. And differential access in terms of power to information, which could be health information or even information about our own histories. Power as resources, but not just capital resources, social networking resources. Power as voice, voice in media, voice in government, and the like. I will say that in my country and in here, people look at these examples and they get concerned about that top set of examples. And they say, well, Dr. Jones, look at that first set of examples, housing, education, employment, income. Isn't that what we call social class? Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism? Or are you really, really, really talking about social class? I need to answer that question because in both of our countries, but especially here, many people default to a social class analysis really as a way, I think, of denying the salience or pertinence of racism. And my answer, I'm going to give you my US answer, but it's the same here. It doesn't just so happen that people of color in the US or in the UK are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in our countries are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized, stigmatized, or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So in the United States, for indigenous North Americans, American Indians, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land. And then the near genocide, and then moving the survivors to reserve lands. And then, in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them off that valuable land to someplace else. In the United States, you know, you hear all about the Mexicans at the southern border. Well, there have been generations of Mexican families that never crossed the border, but the border crossed them. They find themselves in New Mexico and the other southwestern states, and they are still being harassed and vilified and dehumanized and targeted, as in the El Paso massacre now, I think 4 or 5 years ago in Texas, as well as lynchings in the 1800s and throughout. Chinese Americans were brought to the U.S. To help build our transcontinental railway, but in the 1880s with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, laws made it impossible for them to bring their families from China or to marry. Japanese Americans during World War II were interned in prison camps, but Italian Americans, German Americans weren't treated that way. And then, for people of African descent, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people, our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage, and then for the survivors and their progeny for generations and generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build that country. Likewise here, but you guys did a lot of that offshore until you invited, the Windrush generation here and then mistreating them and taking away their citizenship. I don't even know the whole history, but these historical things happen. So now when I talk about what happened in the US, and people will say, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, don't you remember that the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865? And we're now in 2023. which makes that 158 years ago. Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the answer is in the question, isn't it? All else being equal. All else has not been equal since 1865, and all still is not equal today, and there are present-day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and all the other initial historical injustices that I described, and these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of structural or institutionalized racism. So, when people ask me, are you talking about racism, or are you really, really talking about social class, I say that institutionalized or structural racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race. That is not just a happenstance, and that is a very important aha. Before I get off of this level, and I spend so much time on this level because this is the most important one for us to understand, and when we live in countries which are so narrowly focused on the individual that we don't even think structures have any relevance if they exist at all, this is the one that I need to really, really clarify. So before I leave this, I have to say that structural racism can be manifest through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very, very often it shows up as lack of action, inaction in the face of need. In fact, if you see inaction in the face of need, that's a little flag there like, look over here for structural racism, okay? The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. There are many ways that it shows up. I'm not even going to read these for you because I'm trying to be focused. But like structural racism, this level can also show up through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing. But even more important is to recognize that it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. And I will say, at least in the United States, this is a very important understanding because in our laws still, there's often the burden to show intent. Disparate impact is not deemed within many of our laws to be sufficient to show that there's something very tragically differential going on by race. The third level of racism is also differential by race. For members of structurally disadvantaged races, it shows up as acceptance of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. For members of structurally advantaged races, it shows up as a sense of entitlement, which actually requires racism denial. Because if you feel entitled to what you have, then there can be no unfair system going on. With regard to health outcomes, for members of structurally disadvantaged races, it shows up as self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from that school or go to that university and the like. The white man's ice is colder syndrome. That phraseology I first heard from my parents. And what it meant then for Black folks and other people of color in the United States, and what it still means for those of us today, for many of us, is imagine that you needed a lawyer. You, as a Black person, I might seek out a white lawyer over a Black lawyer. Or if I were sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the Black doctor if I could even find a Black doctor. And if my lemonade were warm, why, I would go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the Black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. It shows up as resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, and really is about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed, the box in which violin is not a Black instrument and the like, in which when young people are succeeding in school, they are acting white, right? Since when did white people claim, only access to excellence? They did not, right? You'll notice that I don't have health outcomes for members of structurally advantaged races. That's because for a long time I couldn't figure out how could a sense of entitlement turn into bad health outcomes. But I will tell you this. There are now a lot of people in the United States who are walking around with a sense of entitlement thwarted. They are walking around with a sense of grievance, blaming all the people of color for what they don't have and, all of this. And it's even been described that these people are suffering from diseases of despair. They don't talk about Black maternal mortality differences as diseases, but these diseases of despair, which include suicides and the second opioid epidemic. So I do acknowledge that for some people, when it's a sense of entitlement thwarted, can also have health impacts. So now I'm going to tell my story. I'm actually going to put my clicker down for a minute, because I'm going to use my hands a lot, if you thought I used them then. And my mic is still clear, right? Like asking my daughter and my husband. Anyway, this second story, which I call The Gardener's Tale, was sparked by something that I saw, again, from my own real life. So before I tell you a story about racism, I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me and my husband. We had been married about a year, and we moved cities. We moved out to Baltimore, where we bought our first freestanding house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all over the porch. And we bought this house in October, so that really wasn't the time to plant in Baltimore. So we waited, but when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, ran outside with our marigold seeds, going to decorate our cute little house. But he came in almost immediately, and he said, well, some of these boxes have dirt in them, but some of these boxes are empty. I need to go down to the gardening store. So he does. He goes to the gardening store. He comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up those empty boxes, and then we plant equal numbers of marigold seeds in all of the boxes, and we water all of the boxes equally, and by this time I'm exhausted because I'm not the gardener in the family, so I figure I'm going to sit back and be delighted. 3 weeks later, as I'm walking out of my front door onto my porch, I finally pay attention to these flower boxes, and this is the truth. What I saw made me literally stop in my tracks. Because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous-looking plants. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were kind of scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in that potting soil had sprouted. And the strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died, and even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And there are several of you guys nodding here, because maybe you're gardeners. I know this is a country of gardeners, right? And maybe you've composted half of your garden. So maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes, and you understand this image to be about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we're going to have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and the pink seed over in the poor, rocky soil, and 3 weeks later in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seeds sprout, strong red seed, tall and vigorous, weak red seed at least survives and makes it halfway up. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. Here comes a strong pink seed, struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we interrupt the story there to say this first part of this story is how structural racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate. And then through lack of action, inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But where would personally mediated racism be in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she's looking at the red flowers, and she said, these red flowers sure are beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers, and she says, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly, so she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff going on in my country, at least. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or perhaps not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking that red is so beautiful, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees. Yeah, please, thank you. It's distracting for me. He's doing the echo. I know it must be distracting for you guys too, but I was in the middle of my story, but now you're doing it. We're going to take a little break. We're at internalized racism. I know it's my laptop, but I don't know how to turn that sound off. Anyway, okay. Oh, it's gone, thank you. Or is it gone? Anyway, internalized racism, so the red flowers, you know, just enjoying being red, right? Pink flowers looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. Here come the bees. The bees minding their own business, collecting nectar, pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzz, over into one of the pink flowers, and then bzz, to another pink flower, and bzz, to this pink flower. This flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, well, what do we do to set things right in this garden? So we could start with addressing the internalized racism. We can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful. Thank you, power to the pink. And that is a very important intervention. I'm not, throwing any shade on that, but if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. So we do. And in our workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in the garden, we must address the structural or institutionalized racism, which means we have to break down the boxes and mix up the soil. Or if you are like, so you need your separate boxes right now in the current, with that same gardener, it makes it easier for that same gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you need that, then it means we must enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do, the pink flowers will flourish. They will look beautiful, grand, and glorious. So that in that intervention on the structural racism, we will have also addressed the internalized racism, because pink won't be looking over at red thinking red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the structural, we may also address the personally mediated racism. Now I give you, that original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink. But her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism: structural, personally mediated, and internalized, and to strongly assert that if we want to set things right in the garden, we must at least address the structural racism. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the structural, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But there's a very important question remaining, which is, who is the gardener? Whoops. Stop, stop, stop. Close your eyes, close your eyes. I can't get it back. Oh, no. Okay, close your eyes. I made too many clicks. Okay, so who's the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which really are the elements of self-determination. So in the US context, who is the gardener? Well, government. Oh, did I mess something up? No, but I want them to get it too. It's good now? Oh, could you hear the echo now? Oh, you see the red thing? Oh, I was wondering what that red thing was. Thank you, Anne. Okay, so Who is the gardener? The one with the power of self-determination, the power to decide, the power to act, control of resources. So in the US, that clearly includes the government, but it's not only the government. It's media, foundations, corporations, health systems, communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. When she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so now the question is, what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions can come out of this. And I want to just share 2 questions before we go into the last 2 stories, which are very quick. But the first question, I was asked in an audience like this. Somebody raised their hand. Dr. Jones, excuse me. Yeah. Why should the red flowers share their soil? And when I heard that question, I loved that question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism that might be otherwise difficult if we were talking about racism between you and me. My answer to that question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the whole garden. Here's another question. What if that's not the original gardener we're looking at? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And the great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So very quickly, the first thing we need to do is make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. We need to put it on our urgent action agenda. Once we've done that, though, we might feel flummoxed or confused. What are we supposed to do? So the second thing is we need to make those flower boxes transparent. We need to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil so we can address the differences in the quality of the soil. But here's the third thing. As we make those flower boxes transparent, we also need to make sure that everybody understands that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we must talk about history, and we must talk about how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink, and not just initial preference, initial and continued preference for red over pink, set up the whole situation and is perpetuating it. So we must talk about cultural racism, some people call it, white supremacist ideology, if we're going to set things right. Because if we do not address that initial and continued preference for red over pink, even if we were able to compel that red gardener today to enrich the poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil today, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So when we are trying to set things right, my story for many years was just about structural racism. But now I understand that we have to do, if racism both structures opportunity and assigns value, we need to address both of those if we're going to set things right in our garden. Here's the next story. This story is to help us understand that racism is a system. I call it cement dust in our lungs. And even though we might all feel like we live with this right now, I mean, it wasn't an actual image. This is, that's something I lived with in my life. When I say cement dust, as I tell you this story, I want you to think cement dust. And I also want you to think racism. So imagine that there is, oh, now we have to get back in it. Why? Why did it not? Hold on. Oh, okay, there, thanks. So imagine that there's a cement factory spewing cement dust, and the cement dust fills the air. Any of us who are anywhere near that factory for any amount of time will develop cement dust in our lungs. And this cement dust in our lungs is problematic for all of us. It might affect different ones of us differently. Maybe cement dust in my lungs makes me feel that I'm not as good as, while cement dust in somebody else's lungs makes him feel he can, with equanimity, crush the life out of another human being with his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. But it's problematic for all of us, even for those who don't recognize or acknowledge they have cement dust in their lungs. So the question is, what are we going to do about this problem? Well, should we focus on the individual, actually, because the dust is in our individual lungs? Well, what might that look like, right? I'm going to give you 2 ways it might look, and I'll say that this is not my favorite strategy. Maybe we could have a machine that screens how much cement dust is in everybody's lungs. And then if it comes to somebody with too much dust, meh, 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 an alarm goes off. Well, the first problem with this for me is how much dust is too much dust, and what are we going to do with those people? Are we voting them off the planet? We don't have much to do about that, although we could think about not voting them off the planet, but we could no. No, but we could think about what we could do. But the big problem is that it makes people not even want to talk about cement dust, right? Because they think if you say, so now I'll go back and just say racism right here. If you say the word racism, they think you are actually trying to peer deeply into their souls to figure out exactly how racist are you. So that interferes with the whole naming of racism. This is part, actually, you know, the racism denial, a lot of that is because they say, well, I'm not racist, because they think that we're talking about and examining them one by one. But what if there's somebody who says, I know I have cement dust in my lungs and I really want it out? Well, we could set up some cleansing spas, trainings or whatever. And people could either volunteer or be encouraged to go in. They go in, they read a lot, they read history, they come out as good as new. But if they come out into that same cloud of dust, then the dust is just going to reaccumulate in their lungs. So it's not a very permanent solution, which we've seen in many of our interventions that we've tried. But here's a clue now. I said when they come out into that same cloud of dust, well, maybe do we need to acknowledge the cloud? Should that be the focus of our work? Well, at least if we acknowledge the cloud of dust, then I would know that I wasn't born with cement dust in my lungs. It was because I'm in this cloud of dust. And it also makes me feel, well, maybe I could put on a gas mask, right? I could start my individual anti-cement dust journey, knowing that I have to keep that gas mask on 24/7, because if I take it off, more dust will come in, recognizing the gas mask in and of itself is not going to suck the dust that's already in my lungs out, but it's a good situation, you know, and I check myself every time I pass a mirror or every time I pass a window or reflection to make sure that the gas mask is still there, right? But the real good thing about it is that you guys see me and you say, well, Dr. Jones, why are you wearing a gas mask? And I say, do you see this cloud of dust? So we start talking about culture or white supremacist, you know, culture and that kind of thing. And more people will say, well, oh no, I'm going to get my own gas mask. I don't want to be bringing this in. So more and more people put on their own individual gas masks. They start their own individual anti-racism journeys, and that's good, right? And is it the answer? Maybe all we need is 330 million gas masks in the US, you know, baby gas masks, old people gas masks, what, 60 million gas masks here? Well, it's a start, but what we really need to do is dismantle the factory. So especially those of us who have put on our gas mask and started our own individual anti-racism journeys and can breathe more easily and we can actually maybe see more clearly, we need to move into action, get near the factory, which has been obscured by all the dust that is thrown up, that some people don't even know there's a factory in there. And then we need to ask, how is this cement factory operating here? Looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And then once we have some of those answers, we need to organize and strategize to act to dismantle that factory and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. So not only is this story to help illustrate that racism is a system, it's the cement factory. Yes, it does out the dust, and yes, it does affect individuals. So it's a system, and we can intervene at those other things, but if we really want to set things right, we must address it at the systems level. I asked the question, how is the cement factory operating here, which is like the question, how is racism operating here? And we need, racism is not a cloud, it's not a miasma with, it's not a miasma cloud, but it's a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms which are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And to most folks like me, that sounds like a headache. What am I supposed to do with that? Structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, until we recognize that actually these are the elements of decision-making, right? Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the decision-making table and who's not, what's on the agenda and what's not. And my first plea to all of us in this room is whenever we are finding ourselves at a decision-making table or setting one, we should look around and say, well, who is not here who has an interest in this proceeding? And then our job is not to represent their interest. Our job is to actually create space and find them a way to the table. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making, practices are the unwritten how in the here and now, just watch me, you'll see how we do things. Norms are the unwritten how, but deeply embedded and how we expect you to do things going forward. And values are the why of decision-making. And actually, if you think, how is racism operating in my job or in this policy that was just placed? If you spend 5, 10, 15 minutes focusing on anything, then you can identify 5, 10, 15 levers for intervention, targets for action right there. I do it every time I talk to a group about a new topic. So this is a very useful thing to do. Here's the last story, and then we're going to shift into the anti-racism collaborative. This story also was not sparked by my own real life. Well, it was sparked by me reading a book. The book was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who used to be the president of Spelman College. And in her book, she describes racism, especially she's describing it to white people who say, I'm not racist, right? As a passive process like being on a conveyor belt moving inexorably through racism and toward racism. I want to take her image about racism as a passive process, just living your life on a conveyor belt, and I want to expand a lot on that image to talk about how we become actively anti-racism. So first of all, I'm going to put us on this conveyor belt, right? So mind you, some people are on top of the conveyor belt just living their lives. Some people are being ground up by the conveyor belt to keep it moving. So I recognize that. But let's say that people are on top of the conveyor belt and it's moving inexorably through and toward racism, but they're just living their lives, raising their kids, going to jobs. And actually, there's a big sign up there that says racism, racism, racism. But some people are so involved in their lives that they don't see it. And somebody might look at them and they go, oh, racism. And then they close their eyes. So they're in racism denial and they keep on going. Or somebody might say, oh, racism, and then they turn around, but they don't do anything else. So maybe they're colorblind, but they keep on being dragged into this system. So modern racism is most often passive. But now I've run out of conveyor belt over there, so I'm coming back over here. But what about us, right? I know some of us are really being ground up, but this is a communication tool, right, for me. What about people who are on top of this conveyor belt, moving, going, just living their lives, but they look up and they say, racism. Well, if it's us, we do need to turn around, right? But we also need to act, right? We need to take a step, and we need to take another step. We need to move into action, and we need to start walking at least as fast as the conveyor belt is moving, just to stay in the same place. Now, let me ask you this. What happens when you are walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You start bumping into people and it becomes uncomfortable for them and uncomfortable for you, and they're like, hey, buddy, watch out, what are you doing? Which is your opportunity to do the first of the 3 tasks of being anti-racism, which is to name racism, to say, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there, or will you turn with me? Now, most people do not want to be disturbed from their comfort, as we discussed before. So they might just say, well, just get out of my way. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn. So now you have 2 or 3 of you walking backward on this crowded conveyor belt, and you keep bumping into people, and you keep naming racism and inviting people to turn, and more will turn. Never 50%. Don't hold your heart out for 50%. But now you're going to develop like a critical mass, right? And now you have this critical mass that's walking like not just away from the sign, but where are you trying to get? You're trying to get to the motor that is running this system. So now you're at the motor, so now this is the time for the second part of, the second task of anti-racism as a process, which is to ask, how is racism operating here? So I think it's this lever. So I'm going to pull up on the lever, and the whole system starts shaking, and I've done it. Except racism is a very fancy system, so it reconfigures itself, and it keeps on going. Which is the importance of the third task of being actively anti-racism, which is to organize and strategize to act. So as I'm pulling up on the lever, I need you to push a button. I need you to pull on a pulley. I need you to swing that pendulum. I need all of us to take some part of this system, because I really do believe that all of us working together can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potential. I ordinarily might stop there, but I want to say I said there were 4 key messages. Racism exists. Racism is a system. Racism saps the strength of the whole society, and we can act to dismantle racism. And I shared 4 allegories. The dual reality helped with racism exists. The cement dust in our lungs with racism is a system. The gardener's tale with levels of racism is about racism saps the strength of the whole society. And life on a conveyor belt, moving to action. Whoops. There you go. Life on a conveyor belt, moving to action about we can act to dismantle racism. So now I'm just going to quickly share with you a framework that I call an anti-racism collaborative with 8 collective action teams. So you're going to see the names of 8 collective action teams. How did we come up with this? This is based on, when I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we organized a racism and health work group, which became an official CDC scientific work group. We had to do bylaws, and we had 7 standing committees. All of these things were the names of the standing committees, except history. Even we, at that time, didn't recognize the importance of including work on history. So when I became president of the American Public Health Association, we did some more work on this, and we added an 8th committee. What I'm going to do right now is, for each of these 8 things, but it won't take long, I'm going to share with you kind of guiding questions and early ideas for action. Most of these you will recognize were inspired by my life in the United States, but they're transferable here, and one in particular I did a little bit of research, especially for you guys in the UK. So with regard to communication and dissemination, guiding questions include, how can we support the naming of racism in public and private spaces, and what tools and strategies are needed to start community conversations on racism, where early ideas for action include developing a communication toolbox, including allegories, billboards, films, podcasts, songs, tweets, webinars, whatever it is that you do creatively can go into that toolbox. Another idea is to put racism and anti-racism on community agendas. So even in workplaces, every Thursday at noon, we'll have an anti-racism chat. Whoever wants to come talk about what happened in the news, what happened to you, or whatever. Or civic dinners, that's a model based on the Chicago dinners and been replicated in Atlanta, where every month, we actually do it with a playwright doing a new bespoke, one act, one person short play, and people talking about that and an issue over dinner, or town hall meetings like I would say we're doing now. So that kind of thing. For the second group, education and development, the guiding questions include, how can we support training around issues of race, racism, and anti-racism at educational institutions of all levels, and what does effective anti-racism curriculum even look like? Where early ideas include convening anti-racism scholars and activists who've been doing trainings and teaching and all, and develop curricula for schools of public health, medicine, social work, law, there, as well as curriculum for K through 12 is what we call your primary and secondary school education. And also, I plan to publish each of my allegories. I've shared 4 with you today. I have about 6 or 7 in the public domain and about 40 on my computer, to publish each one as a separate children's book, to do what I describe as interrupting the intergenerational transmission of racism denial. The third group, Global Matters, guiding questions include, how can we use the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICERD, to support anti-racism work in the United States or in the United Kingdom? Who in this room has ever heard of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination? I see about 7 hands, 8. That's more than in most rooms in the US. Okay, what is it? For those who don't know, it's an international anti-racism treaty. Who even knew there was an international anti-racism treaty? But there is. It was passed by the UN General Assembly in 1965. Wow, who knew? Do you think the US signed that? Yes, in 1966. Do you think the UK signed that? Huh? Yes, in 1966. Do you think the US ratified it? Yeah, but 28 years later, in 1994, do you think the UK ratified it? Yes, 3 years later. But what are you guys doing with it? I don't know, because people don't know about it. What it does is, under that treaty, first of all, it's only a 9-page treaty, right? So you could read that tonight. And is like do right about racism. Under the treaty, countries are supposed to submit a report, periodic reports every 2 years, but they're allowed to cluster them into 5-year bundles. They submit a report to a committee at the UN, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I'm not making this up. Everybody who's young, Google ICERD, I-C-E-R-D, and even those of us in my age, you can Google I-C-E-R-D, and you can find your treaty and all of your reports and all. When you do that, so you submit a report to the committee sends back its concerns and recommendations. And it's a blueprint about what you're supposed to do, what you have international treaty obligations to do. In the US, I mean, it's describing, the achievement gap in education and health disparities and prison, all the things we're supposed to do. Every time it's that. But that would be a useful tool for community organizing. And anyway, what else can we learn from anti-racism work in other nations? So early ideas include inform the US and UK publics about national obligations under ICERD and take a look at the most recent concerns and recommendations report back to the government from the committee, and examine anti-racism efforts in other countries, some of which are doing truth and reconciliation or whatever they're doing, and participate in global conversations, not just about anti-racism, because everybody doesn't call it that, but decolonization, structural discrimination, social justice, but understand that this is a global struggle. In terms of history, guiding questions include what is the history of successful anti-racism struggle in the United States and around the world, and how can this history guide our anti-racism work today? Also, how can we institutionalize attention to history in all of our decision-making processes? This is very important, because I think that if you're trying to untie a knot, wouldn't it behoove you to know how that knot got tied? So early ideas include teaching our full histories. These are examples from the US, but there should be full histories. Sometimes in the interim, we need, in our community schools, Saturday schools or after schools, we need to be teaching our full histories if the curriculum where we live is not doing that. In the United States, across the country, there are many, many states banning the teaching of our full histories. So we have to do something else. But to hire historians to staff decision-making bodies. Am I going too fast or right pace? It's all good. For liaison and partnership, guiding questions include what anti-racism work is happening at the community level, and what anti-racism work is happening in other sectors. So if I'm in health, what's law doing? What is the business sector? What is entertainment doing? And then how can we create linkages between those? Early ideas include cataloging and then connecting local anti-racism efforts throughout our nations and the world, and also drafting an anti-racism commitment agreement. Like what is the core, if you're going to be anti-racism, what are the core things that we really think all of us should be committing to for communities, businesses, and organizations across sectors? With regard to organizational excellence, how do we answer the question, how is racism operating here in each of our settings? How do we examine structures, policies, practices, norms, and values? Give me the handbook for that. And I've done some thinking, especially around policies and around values on that, but there's a lot of room for work on that. But early ideas include identifying policies. So I have distilled 4 classes of policies that I think are part of structural racism. Those policies that segregate resources and risks, those policies that create inherited group disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited group advantage, those policies that favor the differential valuation of human life by race, including media policies or curriculum policies, and those policies that limit self-determination. Like in our country, in many states, if you have ever been convicted of a felony, you can never vote again. Policy and legislation. What are current policy and legislative strategies to address and dismantle racism? So what's happening in the law? And what new strategies should we propose? Where early ideas include cataloging formal anti-racism policies. Here I'm talking about the US. Do you know that, well, you heard it, 260 local jurisdictions, city councils, county commissions, state legislatures at some point in the US across 41 states and the District of Columbia have passed declarations that racism is a public health crisis. That's huge because at least they're naming racism. Some of them stop there. They say, okay, we're putting a stake in the sand. We know racism exists. Hold us accountable. But some are going further. Well, catalog those, and the American Public Health Association website is doing that. If you go to www.apha.org, so I know it's US, but it's a good model for things, You can actually look at all 260 of these things. You can see where they're located. You can click on it and see the text of it and all of that. It's great. But also develop and disseminate model legislation addressing not just, yes, racism exists, but what are the mechanisms of structural racism, educational policy, housing policy and the like. And finally, for science and publications, what research has been done to examine the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation and the world? So that's a good thing. You have to document, right, that racism exists. Many levels of documentation. That racism exists, that is having harmful impacts. But then what intervention strategies have been evaluated? We can't stop with just documenting it exists. Again, this call to action. Name racism, yes, but then you've got to move to action. And in fact, I think the research that we need right now is intervention research. We need to invest massive investments in communities of color around education, housing, job development, environmental cleanup, and the like. That's what we need to do. And then what new measures and methods are needed? And I put that in because I'm a methodologist. I create measures of racism and methods and all that. But I think that that's fertile ground. We are very creative people, so we need to think about that. So early ideas include putting measures of racism on population-based surveys. These are all US surveys. But wouldn't it be interested, I know you have your National Health Service and you do a lot of your health analysis using those data, but what if you had a population-based survey? We have a 6-question reactions to race module I'd be happy to share with you guys if you want to look at it, and you started looking at it not just in health and all, but put measures of racism on these population-based surveys and develop the science and practice of anti-racism. What is that? Well, I tell you this, the science and practice of anti-racism has to include anticipating and preparing for pushback. In the United States, we should never have been surprised that after an Obama presidency, there came a Trump presidency, right? We need to anticipate and prepare for pushback. So we are at the close. What can we do today? And I'm going back to that initial image from the dual reality. So first thing is we need to actively look for evidence of two-sided signs. Is there something differential going on here by race, by gender, by education, by accent, by geography, by all of the different ways that, religion and all of the ways we divide ourselves, looking not just at outcomes, but also at opportunity structures. We need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity. What do I mean by a bubble of experience? Well, all of us live in bubbles of experience. Our jobs, our families, our communities, if we have, social clubs or religious affiliations. Some of our bubbles are quite large with thin soap bubble boundaries. Some of our bubbles are smaller with thicker plexiglass boundaries. Some of our bubbles have been tinted, colored. Some have been polarized. In the US especially, some people's bubbles have been hardened by fear. But whatever kind of bubble each of us lives in, most of us really do not know that just across town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who are living in very different circumstances. So we need to create at the individual level as well as at institutional levels bubble-bursting opportunities so we can experience our common humanity in different circumstances, recognize that common humanity, and start building common cause. We need to be interested in the stories of others, believe the stories of others without requiring cell phone video documentation or, God forbid, police body cam footage. And then we need to join in the stories of others. And I was heartened, 2020, 2021, 2022, there was more of that. But, people are getting a little bit tired of that, too. It's like, oh, anti-racism and all that, we all in this together, all that is getting very, starting to feel old to some people. We need to continue doing that. We need to develop the sensitivity to see the absence of. This is one of my special sensitivities that I have developed that makes people think, oh, how did you know to ask that question? We need to be able to say who is not at the decision-making table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that are put in place could bring about more social justice. That's a very good power. And we need to reveal inaction in the face of need because that is a classic hallmark of structural racism, indifference and inaction in the face of need. But all the power is not just on those who are inside the restaurant. Those on the outside, we need to know our power, especially that action is power, and especially that, collective action is power, because collective action informs us, it inspires us, it propels us, and it protects us. So thank you very much for letting me share all of these different tools, some communication and action tools, and I look forward to our discussion right now. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. You know that was wonderful, right? Come on now. Like vocal, come on.
Thank you.
You're in the presence of greatness. We are in the presence of greatness, and what is actually the art of the possible in what we often perceive as being impossible. This is how we make the change. Naming racism, looking at how it operates here, and getting well strategic about how we actively transform that, and we do that over and over and over again until it is no longer an issue, and we all are living as human beings who are thriving and flourishing because we've all got great soil. So you know what?
Just preach, Jackie.
Hey, 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 hey. Hey. You know, so this is the kind of nourishment that we all need, you know, and it's very empowering, actually, when you hear it as how articulated by Camara. We know that this is possible. So you've got an opportunity, if you don't mind staying a little bit longer, to ask some questions. Camara, you're able to stay a little bit longer to...
I am. Let's see what time
it's
is it.
nearly 7 minutes to 8.
Oh, my Lord.
I know.
Thank you for staying as long as you have. Yeah, thank you for staying.
So we're good for another 10 minutes maybe for questions, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if we could take them a few at a time so that we give an opportunity for people to ask, and that if people could be really precise, that would be helpful.
And maybe what we should do is come down here now with the mic, and people who have questions might even want to line up.
Have you got the
I have mine
UPS?
still on,
Okay,
so I'm
cool.
good.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. That was wonderful. Really a delight and insightful and broken down so that everybody can follow you. That's really great. Want to maybe suggest something or add something to your toolbox, because it's an irritant. You talked about internalized oppression and the impact of internalized oppression. One of the manifestations of that we as black people also collude with, is that little island called Africa. We refer to 54 countries.
Thank you.
That is phenomenally large, that is larger than any single European country. We name France, we name Spain, we name Germany, we name Italy, and we dehumanize 54 countries to the one word, Africa.
Yes.
And that's an impact of internalized oppression for the richest, biggest landmass on the planet. And I would like you to maybe include that, say something about that, so that we get the message that Africa is phenomenal. It is the richest landmass, and we should be honoring that and respecting that and not minimizing it to a single word.
Thank you for that. I often comment.
Are there other questions? If not, we will just... Yeah, okay.
Here.
Dr. Jones, just a question. When you are on that table of decision makers and there is a consistent decision maker who is not there, who is important, who is not there, and
start at the beginning.
Okay, so when you are at that table of decision makers and there is one decision maker who's very important that consistently is not there, what does one do?
Any other one in the first round? Okay, so let's take those two.
So about the thing, I mean, it irks me no end when people say Africa as if that were, oh, thank you. As,
I forgot to say, we've moved Egypt because it's a value into the Middle East.
haven't we? Haven't we? Yes. And so I take your point very much. In fact, I once wrote a letter. I saw like a New York Times article, and they talked about New York, France, and Africa, like in the same, like New York, comma, France, comma, and Africa. So a city, a country, and a continent. So it's infuriating, but yes, even we sometimes do that. Every time I hear that, or somebody might say, well, I'm from Africa. I said, well, that's a huge continent. What country are you from? You know, so I mean, even then, we've learned, if we come from here, to go into that kind of, to pander to that ignorant status, when in fact, we could educate people all the time by insisting on naming where we're from. I also have that feeling about names, honestly. So if you mispronounce my name, which is pronounced Camara, I will correct you. But other people who come from different countries, they'll just say their name and it's not pronounced correctly, but they say, oh, well, you know, I'll answer to anything. I was like, no, because people shouldn't be reading your name, right? A name is something that is heard first. That's what it is. And so if your name is supposed to be pronounced the way it can. So anyway, so all of that, but yes, I do. So I'll think about how I could routinely bring that up. Thank you for that. When you say a decision maker who's always not there because what? Because they don't care about that proceeding. Right, they don't care. So then we have to move without them in some kind of way, you know what I'm saying? Like they can't hold up everything, you know, they have the power, I don't know, you know, but we also have power. That's what I'm saying. Even if we're not inside that restaurant eating, even if we're not at the decision-making table, if there are enough of us, there's collective action that is enhanced by critical mass. We have the power of being able to build critical mass. That's what we should do. And we shouldn't be, huh?
About allies.
Yeah, of allies? Yes. Oh, you want me to talk about that thing too? Or no? Okay, here, Herbie. You want to say something?
No, just you bring allies to the...
But I don't even like, yes, we do, but it's not even allies, because sometimes when you say the word allies in the context of anti-racism work, people think about white folks. That's allies. I know you didn't. I know you didn't. But that's, and people have courses on being an ally or, you know, an upstander as opposed to a bystander and all this stuff. And I think that's very destructive. Why? Well, first of all, if you're an ally, that's a very loose relationship. And if it's time for you to go on your 4-week holiday, you might say to the folks who are in the struggle, oh, well, you know, good luck with the struggle. I'll check you in 4 weeks. No. Racism is sapping the strength of the whole society. So we are compatriots. We are together in this struggle, and we need to recognize that and have a very deep connection and investment in that. So you know, you can't make people care. But maybe you can move them out of the way. Maybe you can organize around them. It takes one person against one person who perceives they have little power and one person who perceives they are all it. One against one, that's not a good mismatch, but that one who thinks they're all it against 50 is a pretty good match. Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
My question is,
put it even closer to your mic. Well,
we live in a society where there's denial of racism. So how are we going to deal with that? I mean, I'm coming to this venue, and at Vauxhall Station, and what I notice is they want us to embrace Brixton. And the only black person I saw there was a man selling fish. Now, in Brixton, there aren't any black people selling fish. But for this advert, there is a black man, and all the other people were white. So tell me, how are we going to put...
They want white people to embrace Brixton.
Brixton, because, you know, it used to be very much a black place.
Of course, oh my goodness.
So how are we going to deal with all of that? Because for me, I don't see that white people think they're racist. And if it starts from the very top, because even Johnson says, we're not racist. So how do we deal with that?
So the thing is that we have to, those 4 key messages that I started with have to be the drumbeat. Racism exists. How do you demonstrate it? Well, so she wants the mic back. Jackie, she wants the mic back because we're going to have a conversation here. So racism exists, but how do you demonstrate that? Well, many people see the evidence that we see that racism exists in terms of differences in educational outcomes or differences in wealth and that kind of thing as evidence of laziness or stupidness. So that gets into their, I want to share, after I finish these questions, I want to share a few more slides that are about the barriers to our achieving health equity and our barriers to anti-racism work, the values targets. But so the racism exists, we need to communicate that racism is a system, so it doesn't matter if they think they're racist or not. We are all living in a racist society. There is a cement factory spewing cement dust, and we all have cement dust in our lungs, even though it is affecting us different ways. That racism saps the strength of the whole society, and that we can act to dismantle racism. If we just do that thing. Now, how do you really convince people? They have to go across town. They have to see somebody that maybe they'll never recognize as brilliant as they are or as whatever, but hopefully they would. But experience with people, so that's at the little individual level. But maybe we don't have to wait for them to wake up. You know, we need to organize and we need to protect the children from getting their bad attitudes.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
The baton has been passed to the white other now, and they're the ones who are very much doing the racism.
Doing the anti-racism work. What do you say?
They're the racists now.
Which one? The white?
The white other.
So what's the white other?
From other countries.
Because I don't need to, so now these categories are all, okay. So the white non-British.
Yes, they're the ones.
But the white British are too. I mean.
Oh, they are, but the baton have been passed on.
Wow. Wow.
You know?
Yes.
So we have a lot of work to do.
You're talking to my mic.
I don't know that we can do that work because if people are going to just ignore the fact that there's racism going on, even our own very black people, then what are we going to do?
So this is what I really think, okay, that this work that I outlined, the process of anti-racism, name racism, ask how is racism operating here, organize and strategize to act, rinse and repeat. That work, I with my eyes will not see the elimination of racism. I've already accepted that. I thought that my job was to start a national or global conversation on racism. But then, when I got the platform of American Public, I'm going to go back here so I don't have my back to people. When I became president of the American Public Health Association, then I said I can't come out with some kind of weak national conversation on racism. Let's have a national campaign against racism, which I thought would be my children's thing. Their children, I figured, were going to be dismantling the system, and then their children might be building in a new system. It doesn't have to take that long, but what we have to recognize is we have a part in an intergenerational struggle. There are people who have come before me. I need to reach up to them or read their stuff if they've passed on to understand what did they try that worked, what did they try that didn't work, what are the lessons. Then I need to be very intentional because so many times, we're in the work and we think we're always going to be alive. We're not always going to be alive. I need to be reaching and mentoring up people behind me, younger people, and learning from them too, and their struggles. Right, but so, what we're going to. Okay. But anyway, I just want to say that intergenerational aspect, some people would say, well, if I'm never going to see the end of it, then why should I do anything? Might as well just go be comfortable. You know what I'm saying? But that is not the case. If we don't take up the struggle now, it'll just delay things by another generation. So that's why we have to understand that the action, the collective action actually will feed us even if we don't see the full dismantling of racism. We have to be part of the struggle, and then we need to have barrels of batons, passing batons here, there, and the other one. And everybody who gets a baton from me needs to fashion their own barrel of batons and pass it up. That's how we're going to get this work done. So I'm not despairing. If I were to despair, I might as well die, right? But I don't think that I'll necessarily see it with my eyes, but I am part of the struggle, and that's what I encourage all of us to aim to be.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for giving us the extra time, because it is like we have gone over time, so we're very grateful, both for your staying present here, but also
May
for
I
you
just
giving...
run up and just show, no, I can't.
No,
Okay.
no,
I can't.
we need to, the room, we've only
need
got
to
it for
go
a
out.
certain time,
Okay.
so the staff are waiting to kind of tidy up the whole proceedings. So I just want to close, we are closing with these as a symbol of our thanks.
These are beautiful.
And also to introduce Camara Jones, Professor Camara Jones, as the patron of Black Thrive Global. And so the collective action and the anti-racism collaborative lives on through Black Thrive Global. So we hope that you will all join with us on that agenda going forward. And so with that, we want to say, welcome world, we're on this together. And thank you again for your contribution today.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And thank you all. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and travel in safety.
Thank you.